my name is Dale Hilton, and I'm with the Center for Palladian Studies in America. Tonight, we are really fortunate. We have with us Carter Hulinsky. And Carter is the metadata librarian and special collections manager at the Oak Spring Garden Foundation in Upperville, Virginia. If you haven't had a chance to go yet, you don't want to miss it. Carter's domain is full of rare literary treasures, and I'm sure he can answer any questions about that if you have them. He is the steward, of course, along with the rest of the staff of the extraordinary library and collections assembled by Rachel Lambert, known as Bunny Mellon. And she is, as you're well aware, one of the 20th century's most celebrated gardeners. Carter received his Master of Science in Library Science from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 2023. And he's had experience working at the Smithsonian Archives of American Gardens and at Duke University Library. So he's going to help us understand what some of us will be seeing before too long at Prestwould. He'll tell us about Lady Jean Skipwith, a fascinating figure that should be better known. And we'll also mention Bunny Mellon along the way. Carter, thank you so much. We're happy to have you.
Thank you. It's so wonderful to be with you this evening. And Dale, thank you for the warm introduction. I'm very excited to share with you a little bit about the garden at Prestwood, and specifically Lady Jean Skipwith's contribution to that garden. But I just want to tell you a little bit about how I came to discover Prestwood. It was while I was working at the Archives of American Gardens at the Smithsonian, and it happened to also be my second trip to Oak Spring. I was still a graduate student. I wasn't working for Oak Spring. I came for a course, and I met the garden historian, Matt Griswold. And in that conversation that I had walking around the garden at Oak Spring, I said, what is the greatest garden that you have visited? What is one that a garden historian of American gardens should go and see? And she said, you must go to Prestwood. And I did later that spring. I went to Prestwood. I went with my mentor and his lovely wife, and we spent the day there, and we had a wonderful guided tour, and we walked around the garden. And that was just a few months before I started working at the library at Oak Spring. And, you know, it has never left me. I draw a lot of similarities between Lady Jean Skipwith and Bunny Mellon, nearly 200 years apart, but these women were self-taught. And they were experimenting in their beds. They were very much involved in the work in the garden. Yes, they had lots of help, but they were very interested in getting specific plants for the garden and planning out its design. And also they had a wonderful library, each of them, to support and inspire them as they worked in the garden. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but my focus tonight is really to talk about the garden at Prestwood and to take you kind of on a virtual tour of that. So at this time, I'm going to share my screen and begin my slides. Just bear with me 1 second as I do that. Okay. All right, Prestwood is a late 18th century plantation set along the Roanoke River in Mecklenburg County, Virginia, near Clarkesville. It exists today as both a physical place and a documentary one. The stone house of Sir Peyton and Lady Jean Skipwith still stands, accompanied by an array of early outbuildings. The garden, however, survives in fragments, traces in the ground, outlines of walls, and the foundation of a greenhouse. What distinguishes Prestwood from many of its contemporaries is the remarkable body of written material that survives alongside it. More than 10,000 documents, letters, receipts, plant lists, and diagrams preserved in the Skipwith papers at the College of William and Mary, as well as in sources like the Virginia Gazette and the Mecklenburg County Records. They allow us to reconstruct not only the form of the garden, but the mind that made it. It is through these records that the garden begins to take shape. Scribbled notes on the backs of bills, neatly copied plant lists, diagrams of beds, and invoices for seeds together form what we might think of a kind of paper garden. a written counterpart to the one planted in the ground at Prestwood. For later generations, these documents proved invaluable. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they informed a growing effort to reinterpret early American gardens during the colonial revival period. At sites such as Colonial Williamsburg and Mount Vernon, records of this kind help guide restoration and understanding, ensuring that Lady Jean Skipwith's garden, at least in part, shaped the way the colonial landscape was later imagined and rebuilt. Her lists are at once systematic and deeply personal. Alongside careful notations of species and performance are phrases that reveal the rhythms of garden life. Shrubs to be got when I can, and bulbous roots to get when in my power. There is aspiration here, but also patience and a quiet persistence. From these lists, we can begin to understand not just the garden, but the people behind it. Story begins, as so many Virginia stories do, in England. The name Prestwood derives from Prestwold Hall in Leicestershire, seat of the Skipwith family, whose baronetcy dates to 1622 under James I. Political misfortune during the English Civil War led to the loss of the family estates, and by the mid-17th century, the Skipwiths had established themselves in Virginia. It is Sir Peyton Skipwith, 7th Baronet, born in what is now Petersburg, Virginia, who emerges as the principal figure in the creation of Prestwood. But the full story of the garden cannot be told without turning to another influence. Through his marriages, Peyton Skipwith became closely allied with the Millers, a Scottish family whose influence would prove decisive. The two families had known one another earlier in Petersburg, where Hugh Miller held property before returning with his children to Edinburgh. This earlier connection likely explains Peyton Skipwith's familiarity with the family when he traveled to Scotland in 1763 and married Anne Miller. After Anne's death in childbirth in 1779, he later married her sister, Jean Miller. Having lived in Edinburgh, Jean brought with her the intellectual habits of the Scottish Enlightenment. She would go on to assemble one of the largest private libraries owned by a woman in early America. Through her, the garden at Prestwood takes on its distinctive character, shaped as much by reading and inquiry as by practice. That intellectual life would unfold within a very specific physical landscape. The plantation began in 1765, when Peyton Skipwith acquired roughly 3,000 acres from William Byrd of Westover, later expanding it to nearly 4,500 acres. Situated in Mecklenburg County, one of Virginia's most productive tobacco regions, the estate benefited from fertile lands along the Dan and Stenton rivers. Despite the abundance, Petersburg, the nearest export port, lay 90 miles away, requiring overland transport of the tobacco. In response, the Skipwiths capitalized on their position near Clarkesville, an important crossroads, and profited not only from agriculture, but from their ferry at a key river crossing. Tobacco and corn were cultivated, livestock raised, and enterprises such as mill, blacksmith shop, ferry, and a store supported both plantation and community. By the 1790s, the stone house was underway, and attention turned to shaping the landscape. Much of the property, including an island between the rivers, now lies between the Care Reservoir, completed in 1953. Within this larger working landscape, the garden occupies a very deliberate position. Unlike the great riverfront plantations of Virginia, where formal gardens often stretch between house and water in carefully terraced display, the garden at Prestwood occupies a different position. It lies to the side of the house, set upon a natural slope rather than an artificially leveled plain. This choice signals a departure from prevailing norms. The terrain is not forced into symmetry, but worked with, inclined shaping both movement and perception. The principal rooms of the house, both public and private, windows opened onto the planted beds, ensuring that the garden was a constant visual presence. This sense of intention continues in how the garden was enclosed and defined. The garden is enclosed within walls, establishing a clear boundary between cultivated ground and the surrounding landscape, often described in the period as wilderness. This enclosure was practical, protecting valuable plantings and concentrating labor, but it was also conceptual. Within the walls, order prevailed. Plants were named, classified, tested, and arranged. Outside, the land remained less certain, less controlled. A number of gateways pierced these walls. The largest at the approach road retains original stone, finials, and wrought iron gates with their hardware, while smaller gateways feature wooden gates. Within these walls, the garden itself was carefully organized. And just a note here, you'll see that I have some arrows here on the map, overview of the garden. These relate to the pictures, and you'll see that the orange arrow here corresponds with the view from that angle, and this is that view. And it's the same with the blue, the red, and the purple. Surveyor Samuel Dedman received $22 in 1801 for services in building the garden at Prestwood, reflecting the assistance provided in its layout. The garden's design is structured, though not rigid. Two principal axes organize the space: a main east-west axis stretching from the house towards the family cemetery, and a longer north-south axis approximately 230 feet in length. Broad crosswalks about 15 feet wide intersects these axes, dividing this space into generous parterres. This arrangement, sometimes described as T-shaped, is comparable in scale to the great pre-revolutionary gardens at Carter's Grove and King's Mill. Yet Prestwood's layout is unconventional. The geometry does not align precisely with either the house or the cemetery, giving the garden a sense of independence. And within this structure, planting itself becomes the next layer of meaning. Within these beds, which are identified by the stars, Lady Skipwith planted what she called simples, geometric groupings that intermingled flowers, vegetable, medicinal herbs, and shrubs. Here again, the garden resists easy categorization. Unlike the more compartmentalized landscapes of George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, where ornamental grounds and productive gardens were often kept distinct, Prestwood integrates the two. Beauty and utility are not separated, but combined. A flowering plant may also be medicinal. A fruit tree may serve as ornament. The blending of purposes is especially clear in her approach to plant selection. Particularly striking is Lady Skipwith's interest in native plants. While many of her contemporaries pursued exotic species for agriculture or economic purposes, Skipwith appears to have cultivated local flora for their ornamental qualities. Many of these plants were first gathered on the river island before being transplanted into the garden at Prestwood, where they were studied, propagated, and arranged alongside imported varieties. The images shown here are drawn from Curtis's Botanical Magazine, an important illustrated serial of late 18th century, one that Skipwith may well have had access to, and of which George Washington owned several volumes. The garden, then, is not only a place of planting, but of observation and experiment. Further into the garden, along its principal axis, stood an octagonal summer house, positioned to overlook both the garden and the river beyond. It served as a place of retreat as much as observation. From this vantage point, it offered a comprehensive view of the ordered beds below and the wider landscape beyond. Such structures in the 18th century were often used for quiet recreation, for taking tea, conversation, or reading, providing a shaded space within the garden for both sociability and reflection. It is also believed that Lady Skipwith kept plantation records and her garden journal there, suggesting that this was not only a place of leisure, but of study and work as well. Nearby, another structure supported the more experimental side of the garden. At the northwest corner stood a greenhouse, constructed around 1801 as part of the garden's original design. While no drawings or photographs survive, the sandstone foundation and open cellar suggested a relatively simple structure, perhaps comparable to one of the earliest greenhouses in America, erected in New York in 1764 for James Beekman. Its presence reflects the level of ambition at work at Prestwood, extending what could be grown beyond the limits of the Virginia climate. Other small structures also played a role in the life of the garden, including a bee house, which has long since disappeared, but its presence in the records hints at a garden that was not only carefully designed, but actively used and maintained. The bee house would have supported pollination throughout the parterres, linking practical cultivation with ornamental display. In the 18th century, beekeeping was also an important part of daily life. Honey served as a primary sweetener before refined sugar became widely available, while beeswax was used for candles, sealing letters, and other household needs. Often housing straw skep or simple wooden hives, bee houses were placed with care, reflecting an understanding of the relationship between bees and plant life. In this way, the bee house connects with what we see in the garden, with the quieter systems that sustained it. Even the cemetery, set along the garden's principal axis, is integrated into the composition. This placement reflects a broader 18th century practice of situating burial grounds within the lived landscape rather than apart from it. At Prestwood, it suggested a desire to bring together life, labor, and memory within a single continuous setting. Here, Peyton and Jean Skipwith are buried, their resting place quietly enfolded within the garden they shaped. Positioned along a principal line of movement, the cemetery would not have been hidden, but encountered, part of the daily experience of the landscape. Underlying all of this was an intellectual framework that guided the garden's creation. No account of Prestwood is complete without the library that underpinned the garden. Lady Jean Skipwith assembled a collection of nearly 850 volumes, one of the largest private libraries owned by a woman in early America. Among its contents was Philip Miller's Gardener's Dictionary, an authoritative text also owned by Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. Skipwith's plant list frequently included directions as see one sort or two sort, referring back to Miller's classifications of plants. The edition she used, the 8th edition, published in 1768, reflects a moment when Linnaean taxonomy had been widely adopted. And yet she did not simply follow authority, she tested it. Her notes record plants marked not in Miller. In these cases, she names them herself. For instance, the blue funnel flower, which corresponds to what we now call Virginia bluebells. This impulse to record and reinterpret extends beyond the garden itself. Intellectual life of the garden extended into a more intimate form, a notebook of patterns. This manuscript, later acquired by the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, contains more than 600 floral needlework designs created by Lady Skipwith. Originally used by her daughter for mathematical exercises, it was transformed into a repository of floral forms, cut from letters, book lists, and household papers. Pinholes and evidence of pouncing show that these were working designs transferred onto fabric for clothing and household objects. Just as plants were arranged in beds outdoors, they were composed in thread and cloth indoors. Together, these parallel practices lead us back to the larger meaning of the site. Even without full restoration, the records of Prestwood remain a powerful legacy. They allow us to see beyond paths and foundations and to understand the intellectual and imaginative labor that shaped the place. Prestwood's garden was not simply a setting for plantation life, but an expression of inquiry rooted in books, observation, and the particular conditions of Virginia soil. In this sense, the garden is less a static artifact than an ongoing conversation between old world and new, between text and experience, between the cultivated and the wild. And because Lady Skipwith wrote so much of it down, it is a landscape that we can still, in part, recover, walking it not only with our feet, but with our minds. Thank you so much. I'd be happy to take some questions, and I'm going to show my list of sources for this material, and we'll try to share this with you too if you're interested.
Carter, thank you. That was absolutely wonderful. We enjoyed it so much and learned so much as well. I am happy to facilitate questions. I'm checking the chat messages as we speak. I'm not seeing any yet, so don't hold back if you have a question for Carter. While you're thinking, I'll start us off. Carter, I'm so very interested in the patterns you showed with floral designs, and I just wonder, have you ever run across any objects, say, that have been embroidered with some of those things that can be, some of those patterns, some of those images that can be traced to Lady Jean Skipwith's and her family's work? And I love too that you included the physical information about the pinholes and the pouncing to transfer the patterns. So I'm just wondering if you've ever seen anything that was a product of those floral designs.
I wish I have seen evidence of fabric that's in some collection, but I have not. What I do know is that some of these patterns were copied from published materials based in England in the early 19th century. So we know that there's this exchange of information. She's subscribing to these ladies' magazines that have these designs in them, and then she's putting them in her book to reuse over and over again. I haven't dug too deeply into this topic. I think it needs more research and time, but I don't know if they have ever found anything that belonged to Lady Jean or her descendants and can trace it back to this set of documents, these patterns. It would be great if we could find something.
Thank you so much. And meanwhile, a couple of questions have appeared. One question is, where are most of Lady Jean's papers and letters held? And I think you alluded to that, but tell us more.
Yeah, so a great deal of them are at the archive at the College of William and Mary. And there's also now, I think, quite a bit that has been acquired and returned to Prestwood, thanks to Julian Hudson. I know that even in my number of books that were in her collection, they have acquired more books than that, and I think it may range over 1,000. I pieced a lot of this information through secondary sources. I unfortunately have not been to the archive to see the primary sources, and I hope to do so soon.
Thank you so much. We have another question as well. And in fact, we have two questions that are related to each other. One is, are there any plans to restore any part of the garden? And then a neighbor of Prestwood says, after Lady Jean's death, was the garden maintained? So these questions are somewhat related. So are there plans to restore the garden, and was the garden maintained for a while, at least after her death?
So after her death in the early 1800s, her daughter did continue. This would have been the Cole family. I believe Helen Cole continued to live there and maintain the garden and add to it. So the garden did transition from that late 18th century style. It would have had more of an early 19th century feel and reflects some of those trends of that period. In 1980, fast forward 1980, the Garden Club of Virginia did provide some funds to do a restoration of the garden. They used landscape architect Rudy Favretti. For a number of years, that was maintained at Prestwood, and then there was a cease of relationship. And so what we see in the space now is very much just the hardscape. You see the greenhouse. You saw some of those scallop beds. We'll see that when we visit. And for those who can't visit, they should go another time and see the garden itself. If you look very closely at the landscape, you can see the remnants there in the soil. You won't know what's planted in each parterre, but you'll get a general sense of the outline of the garden. Yes, there is a plant list. And sorry, I jumped ahead. I was excited to see that question, Dale. Well, there's a lot of her plant list. Some of it's been digitized, and I believe I can find the source for you. The Southern Garden Historical Society has put together a great database of historical plant lists from the 18th century, early 19th century American plants. And I believe what they have done is comb through the archives and gathered Lady Jean Skipwith. A lot of these were on scraps of papers. You know, one week she would write to someone and say, I would love to have XYZ plants for this garden. I'm looking for this. And so they compile what she essentially had and what she brought over from that island where she was cultivating the native plants. And they have assembled a list of all the plants that were documented in that archive. And if I can find that link, I will send that to you. Of course, you can always go to the College of William and Mary and look through that garden journal that she kept there.
Unmute. I heard someone say actually today in a conversation that one of the advantages of the landscape of Prestwood was that there had been a little island that was later eliminated, and someone said that was very helpful to her because it minimized the deer damage in the garden. Have you heard anything like that?
I have not heard that. I think it's very interesting when you go to Prestwood and you look at the wall. It's a rather low wall. It's not what you would see in England at that time. You know, a wall would be 6 to 8 feet. This is something you can stand out and look over. So as far as deer deterrent, I have wondered how that was done. I know, but at the same time, what I will say is the way that if you think about 18th century, the land around the plantation would look so different than it does today because to maximize the production of crops, it would have been all cleared. And so you would have open tobacco fields. So this landscape would radically change and the habitat for the deer would not have been sustained like it is today. And secondly, I think we also forget to think about that deer is a source of food. And there probably were a lot less deer in the 1800s in that part of Virginia just because that's what people are eating, if that makes sense. So I think that is probably why, and I'm sure there was a deer that got in the garden at some point. I'm speculating, but it probably wasn't the problem like we now have today.
That's a wonderfully deeply considered answer. Thank you so very much. We have time for another question. If there's anybody that is burning to ask something, go right ahead. And Carter, I don't know if there are any final remarks while we're checking to see if there are further questions that you would want to make about Oak Spring, programs that are coming up, things that you want people to know about Oak Spring?
Well, if you haven't been to Oak Spring, I invite you to Oak Spring. The garden itself is open to the public twice a year for Historical Garden Week. I'm sad to say the tickets have already sold out, but there will be another opportunity in June for you to come and see the formal garden. It is a beautiful place. And if you can go to our website, www.osgf.org, you can look for those dates. The other thing that I think this group would be particularly interested in, and I know that Dale was a participant, is an upcoming short course on Great English Estates. And that is led by Dr. Paul Stampard. And it is a wonderful course. It is my favorite because not only is it wonderful lectures by someone who has spent a lot of time working for English heritage and preserving a lot of those landscapes, but a lot of the time is also spent looking at the historical materials in the library. We have 4 Humphrey Repton Red books. We spend time talking about the landscapes of him, Capability Brown. We look at more formal landscapes. We have a collection of engravings by Kip and Ip of the historic estates in England. So there's a lot there that can be looked at, and you do get to spend quite a bit of time with the collection during that week, as well as you're going to have great classmates who are interested in the subject and a great leader.
Oh, thank you so much. And we had a request. One of our attendees wanted to see your bibliography again. I don't know if you can go back to that slide. And I will say that this lecture was being recorded, so you should also be able to access Carter's slides later on afterwards, and we can send a link to you. But for those who wanted to look at his further readings, here it is again.
And if I can just point out a few, I found that the historical places, the Register for Historical Places, those documents, the top 2, the one by Carter Hudgens and then later the Virginia Historic Landmarks Commission staff, that was very helpful. There's a lot of rich detail, not only about the garden, but of course the house, which I did not talk about. Oh, Dale, you raised your hand. Did you want to?
I'm so sorry. Somebody had raised their hands earlier, and I was just trying to see if they were still with us.
Another great source is Anne Layton's work. She devotes a whole chapter in her work on American gardens in the 18th century. You should have a copy of her book if you have not purchased it. She also wrote one on colonial gardens and then gardens of the 19th century. She's an important garden historian. I also wanted to say a lot of the photographs that I took of that restored garden from the 1980s were sourced from the archives of American Gardens in the Rudy Fabretti collections. So you can consult that as well. Those are available online. A lot of wonderful resources are available through the archives of American Gardens, and you can search that through sova.org. That's the Smithsonian's online database of images. And that could be a whole nother lecture, but there is so much rich information on historical gardens through the Smithsonian that you can just access at your fingertips from your computer. You don't even have to go down to DC to see them.
Well, this has been absolutely wonderful, Carter. You enlightened us and educated us, and it's so kind of you to share your readings with us. We've enjoyed it tremendously. And as I said before, this was recorded, so we will try to send out a link afterwards so people can review what they learned tonight. It was a great lecture. Thanks so much, everybody, for listening in, and hope to see you next time. Take care.